The racialization of space is all present in metropolitan Detroit. Considered one of the most segregated regions in America, everywhere in Detroit and its suburbs in Wayne, Oakland, and Macomb counties have been shaped by the race and socioeconomic status of its inhabitants. As one travels from Detroit's downtown through the inner city neighborhoods to the inner ring and outer ring suburbs, this is painfully present. The greater downtown is now showing all the signs of prosperity. However, the scars of its past are still present in the vast swaths of parking lots that once housed retail, office space, and industry. As one leaves this area to where actual Detroiters live, the city's underbelly and the effects of decades of divestment, job loss, and resulting declining tax base and high poverty rate remain apparent. In 1990, journalist Ze'ev Shavets wrote of the city, "Detroit today is a genuinely fearsome-looking place. Most of the neighborhoods appear to be the victims of bombardment. Houses burned and vacant, buildings crumbling, whole blocks overrun with weeds and the carcasses of discarded automobiles. This situation has worsened in many neighborhoods, especially after the Great Recession and the foreclosure crisis devastated many remaining middle-class families. The vast empty space in this hollowed-out city provides opportunities for pheasants and packs of dogs to reclaim their space in this new ecosystem. Poor schools and mass incarceration sustain cycles of poverty over the course of generations. This level of poverty and abandonment contrasts starkly with the majority white and wealthier suburbs. The difference between these communities is night and day as one crosses a road in certain areas. The most apparent example is the neighboring communities of the Grosse Pointes. In Grosse Pointe Farms, the median household income is $140,000 a year, over 4 times the median income in Detroit of $38,000 a year. The neat, small rows of homes of the inner ring suburbs, those directly adjacent to Detroit like Madison Heights, Dearborn, and Warren, are historically working class, mostly white communities that have begun to deteriorate as wealthier individuals move further away from the city and the effects of divestment, abandoned, job loss that first hit Detroit in the 1970s and 80s spread outward. Outer ring suburbs, generally the wealthiest and whitest communities in the region, are the ones farthest away from Detroit, where fancy grocery stores, great roads, manicured parks, and excellent schools are abundant. The inner city and suburbs can seem like two completely separate worlds, yet are inseparably intertwined. One cannot understand one without the other. Historian June Manning Thomas argues that the fundamental imbalance in poverty and wealth create the divisions present in Metro Detroit. Just as lasting peace is not possible within the world so long as some nations have enormous resources and others do not, so prosperity is not possible within the metropolitan area so long as life opportunities and living conditions vary greatly by race. Substantial literature has been written about Detroit's decline focusing on the city itself, while less has considered the region as a whole and the dialogue, conflict, and attempts of reconciliation between the suburbs and the city. Historian Thomas Agru, in The Origins of the Urban Crisis, Race Inequality in Post-War Detroit, demonstrated that the deep-seated conflicts between whites and blacks in Detroit began long before the 1960s and chronicles the history of racial discrimination and violence in the city. Historian Heather Ann Thompson analyzed the phenomenon of white flight that overtook the city, and June Manning Thomas, in Redevelopment and Race, emphasized the importance of analyzing urban planning and government policy in understanding post-war Detroit. This video is not meant to be a comprehensive history, but merely an introduction to the development, evolution, and issues of urban sprawl in the Detroit region. It will examine both sprawl and its causes in its early development, as well as how it has evolved in contemporary Metro Detroit. Urban sprawl is an overall negative process for individuals and communities, bringing significant consequences for physical and mental health, the environment, and social issues. Studies have shown that sprawl is correlated to the health concerns of physical inactivity, obesity, heart disease, gastrointestinal tract diseases, kidney disease, and cancer prevalence. Adverse environmental effects from sprawl include air pollution, water pollution, energy consumption, extreme heat, deforestation, and disruption of habitat, among others. While this video focused primarily on social issues such as housing, segregation, and regionalism, the effects on health and the environment are also of considerable importance because these issues are at the core intertwined. Detroit's history of urban sprawl can be divided into 4 distinct periods. From 1910 to 1945, policies of housing development and segregation set into place the inevitable collapse in later periods. 1945 to 1975 saw the start of suburbanization and white flight as the tensions over discrimination, housing, urban renewal reached a boiling point culminating in the 1967 rebellion. In 1973, civic power in Detroit began to shift into the hands of African American politicians like Mayor Coleman Young. Attempts to create a unified regional plan for growth was made with the regionalism movement. However, lingering racism in the suburbs and Young's confrontational approach resulted in disagreement on a regional level. After Young's tenure in office from 1994 to the present, this pattern of white flight continued as white residents of inner ring suburbs flee to the outer ring in search of a homogeneous community as black Detroiters begin to integrate into the suburbs. Detroit's contemporary issues of mortgage foreclosures and downtown gentrification by suburbanites have its roots in the 2008 recession and the coerced filing of bankruptcy by the city of Detroit in 2012. The racist and segregationist policies of the local, state, and federal government led to the rapid exodus from Detroit and the subsequent expansion of the metropolitan area. Redlining and urban renewal projects by the federal and local government created division and tension so crippling it led to the abandonment of Detroit by many white residents with their tax money and businesses. Additionally, a lack of rapid transportation and the building of expressways facilitated the economic growth of the suburbs and gutted the city, further drawing residents out. The intentional lack of a cohesive regional strategy for growth and the division of the region into smaller municipalities exacerbates this issue. 1910 to 1945. Policies of housing development and segregation first implemented in the early 20th century would lead to the fundamental problems facing Detroit in post-war years, such as a housing shortage and racial tension. A huge demand for labor in the city's expanding manufacturing market meant that in just 20 years, Detroit's population more than tripled, rising from 465,000 in 1910 to more than 1.5 million in 1930. The arriving migrants came from incredibly diverse backgrounds. Southern and Eastern Europeans, white farmers from rural America, blacks from the Deep South and Caribbean, and innumerable other groups came for the promise of opportunity and a decent living. Despite this massive difference in background, most clusters of ethnic neighborhoods had largely dispersed by the 1920s, and these neighborhoods would find identity in whiteness. These white neighborhoods would be most commonly low-density, single-family homes often in close proximity to factories, offering a short commute. 2/3 of all residential buildings in Detroit were single-family homes, 1/5 were two-family homes, and only 1% were apartment buildings. Most neighborhoods in Detroit would be built during the economically prosperous years of the 1920s. In 1925 alone, over 41,000 building permits were granted by the city. This massive growth was also the beginning of suburbanization. Land developed on what was then farmland would soon be brought into the urban fabric. Property salesman Richard L. Maxon wrote in the Detroit Free Press in 1928, 20 years ago, there was a sharp dividing line between the city and living in the country. Then the country estate was in reality a farm. It was devoid of such conveniences as gas, electricity, and running water, which the city homes enjoyed. Social life was almost unknown, and the city, although perhaps only a few miles away, could only be reached by a long and tiresome journey. As a result, the better class of homes were built in the city, and except for dwellings on the largest and most prosperous farms, country homes were humble and unpretentious. Now, however, the situation is gradually reversing itself. For today, the better class of homes are being built in the suburban areas, away from the noise and the confusion of the city. They have every city convenience available with perfect roads for the motor car. Schools in the suburban areas are in many cases even superior to those of the metropolitan districts. Social life, centering around the country club, is even more complete than in town. The city was able to have such low density because of the abundance of land available within the city and excellent public transportation, such as trolleys and buses, as well as private automobiles that made a long-distance commute possible. This large abundance of land was the result of the annexation of surrounding rural region around Detroit. In just 26 years, the area of Detroit had decreased 5 times from its size in 1900, from 28 square miles to 139 square miles. With annexation, communities adjacent but outside of Detroit's borders were able to consolidate with Detroit to prevent duplication and to better coordinate services, such as public transport. This process largely stopped after 1926, and communities outside Detroit maintained their own municipalities. Home rule, the right of cities and villages to create their own charters and pass laws without interference from the state of Michigan, allowed municipalities to maintain their independence. Henry Ford exploited this rule by establishing his factories outside Detroit in small and agrarian cities like Highland Park and Dearborn to avoid paying taxes to Detroit. This allowed him to dominate the economy, politics, and culture in those cities. In Dearborn, he prevented black workers at his Rouge plant from living in Dearborn, segregating them to the nearby city of Inkster. During this time, several communities would develop to the north along Woodward and downriver to the south. With the growth of cities outside but surrounding Detroit, urban planners and labor activists began advocating for regionalism, but would be met with roadblocks. Regionalism Regionalism is a movement that advocates for the reorganization of the metropolitan area into one of shared government, as opposed to fragmented municipalities. By fragmenting the region, advocates say, issues such as city service duplication and uncontrolled growth are exacerbated. One plan was to develop communities on the periphery of metro areas that were limited in population and contained semi-autonomous economies that prevented long commutes. This orderly approach to metropolitan growth was supposed to prevent the development of fragmented, competitive sets of municipalities. In 1942, the UAW proposed a plan to build 5 new cities surrounding the metropolitan limits and build a greenbelt surrounding each city. A greenbelt is an area dedicated to agricultural or recreational uses meant to prevent the expansion of a city. They also proposed a regional government to control housing in the Detroit area. City officials would attempt to annex surrounding suburbs for the next coming decades, but would fail because of state annexation laws and a lack of funding from the federal government. As people began living further out in the city, these peripheral sections would be connected to the center city by trolleys and buses of the Detroit Urban Railway. However, no rapid transit was ever developed in Detroit because of a lack of funding and support, increased use of the automobile, and the creation of expressways during World War II. In the 1920s, nearly 500 miles of streetcar rails connected the city, and in the 1940s, nearly 1,000 streetcars were ridden by 490 million annual riders. Despite this, public transportation was unpopular as people preferred private automobiles. From 1915 to the 50s, Detroit officials and voters would reject rapid transport proposals nearly a dozen times. The high initial costs of high-speed rail like subways were unpopular compared to the relatively cheaper expressways. The Davidson Freeway, running through Detroit and Highland Park, was the first urban expressway in the United States. By 1956, Detroit's rail started to deteriorate and was replaced with buses. Urban planning after this point was primarily focused on the efficiency of using automobiles, without much consideration towards other modes of transport. In contrast to the low density of white neighborhoods, black residents were confined to the extremely dense districts of Black Bottom and Paradise Valley, with other sparse pockets around the city. Hundreds of thousands of African Americans migrated to the south, to the industrial north, to cities like Detroit, to pursue economic opportunity and to escape the worst of Jim Crow. In response to this massive influx of black residents, white residents began to refuse to sell their homes to black people, use threats of violence to move them out, and use restrictive covenants to make future owners of the homes legally responsible to not sell to black Detroiters. One of the most stark and famous examples of threats of violence against black homeowners was the case of Ozzie and Sweet. Sweet was an African-American doctor that moved into a white neighborhood in 1925. After a mob of his white neighbors descended onto his house for 2 consecutive nights, threatening violence and throwing stones into the house, someone from the home shot 2 protesters and killed one. Ozzie and Sweet and everyone in the home was arrested, but the case was declared a mistrial when members of the jury could not form a consensus on the verdict. The worst outbreak of racial violence during this period came in 1943. When skirmishes between blacks and whites broke out on Belle Isle. Rumors of a race war motivated attacks on both sides. Blacks looted white-owned businesses and 10,000 whites raided Paradise Valley. The police were sympathetic to the white rioters. Among the 17 people they shot and killed, none were white. Moreover, to prevent the integration of African Americans into white neighborhoods, the federal government redlined Detroit in 1939. The Homeowner Loan Corporation ranked Detroit neighborhoods by the race, ethnicity, and economic status of its occupants. Those with a lower score would have a difficult time obtaining a loan. They assigned neighborhoods one of 4 colors on a map. Those with any black family residing in their neighborhood were automatically graded red and deemed hazardous. Neighborhoods consisting of primarily a single ethnic group, such as Polish, were given the grade of yellow for definitely declining. Wealthier white neighborhoods that practiced segregation and sufficiently distanced from black neighborhoods were given the grade blue and deemed still desirable. Only the most exclusive and wealthy neighborhoods north of Highland Park and Grosse Pointe were given the grade of green. By determining who can get a loan with these standards, neighborhoods were economically incentivized to segregate. White neighborhoods began a practice of restrictive covenants by stipulating in contract that the homeowner could not sell their home to African Americans. By 1940, 80% of the homes outside of black areas had restrictive covenants. These policies exacerbated issues of overcrowding as black Americans from the South continued to move to Detroit looking for opportunity. They affected black Detroiters regardless of class or status. Wealthier black Detroiters that could afford to buy a home, highly educated and skilled like Ozzie and Sweet, were also confined to segregated zones. Unskilled workers from the South who were just starting in the automobile industry or forced into domestic service had even fewer options. Denying black residents the right to move into a neighborhood that received electricity, city water supplies, indoor plumbing, and clean streets was systematically designed to inhibit the freedom and opportunities of black Detroiters. Members of the black community and certain white liberals began advocating for public housing as a solution to the housing crisis. However, these efforts would have little success in the face of mass white resistance to such projects. The federally subsidized Sojourner Truth housing complex was subject to a massive controversy when their white neighbors began protesting the completion of the project. Classism, in addition to racism, was a motivating factor in its opposition, as even the wealthy black neighborhood of Conant Gardens was also opposed to the project. The protest turned violent as more than 1,000 supporters and opponents brawled in the street on February 29, 1941, 1945 to 1973. As the city's manufacturing began to decline in a process of deindustrialization, post-war in-migration, urban renewal and expressway construction would continue to exacerbate housing shortages for black Detroiters while allowing white residents to begin to leave the city. Tensions over police brutality and housing discrimination would reach a boiling point in 1967, exacerbating the issue of white flight. Some gains for civil rights were made during this era, such as the constitutional ban on restrictive covenants in Shelley v. Kramer and the ascension of Detroit's first black mayor, Coleman Young. The post-war period of the late 1940s to the 50s is often seen as Detroit's golden era. However, this period saw the beginning of the decline of manufacturing within the city and the loss of middle-class residents to the suburbs. In an attempt to address these issues, Mayor Edward Jeffries, Jr. organized a committee that released a report titled Post-War Improvements to Make Your Detroit a Finer City in Which to Live and Work, that included plans that would have been incredibly beneficial had they came to fruition, such as a plan for public housing and regional coordination, as well as plans that proved to be detrimental, such as urban expressways. With federal government funding, Detroit attempted to revitalize the city through urban renewal. However, this was used as a tool to eliminate the black neighborhoods of Black Bottom and Paradise Valley and replace them with what they considered higher uses to bolster the struggling downtown. With support from the state and federal government, Detroit created a master plan to protect the central business district downtown from encroaching blight from the nearby slums in the inner core area. Beginning in the 1940s through the late 50s, several depressed urban freeways gutted black neighborhoods while promising to improve the city's residential areas and economy. I-375 destroyed the Lower East Side neighborhoods of Paradise Valley and Black Bottom, home to the most significant black population in the city. The Lodge Freeway gutted the Lower West Side, which had historically been home to one of Detroit's Chinatowns, and had increasingly become a black area. I-94 raised the Black West Side and cut through the north end of Paradise Valley. While the owners of property in these districts were compensated due to eminent domain, renters in Black Bottom that comprised 92% of the community were hugely disadvantaged and left to fend for themselves to find housing in an increasingly scarce market. Efforts to house the displaced all but failed. Title I of the Housing Act of 1949 included funding for public housing within urban renewal, but did not require it at the request of real estate lobbies. Black neighborhoods not in the path of the freeway were destroyed for urban renewal projects meant to improve city tax revenue and conditions for residents, such as those in the Lafayette Park neighborhood. They were meant to be replaced with high-rise residential buildings, hospitals, and civic buildings. No low-income housing was built on the site because it was not marketable, as a private developer put it. Urban renewal added to racial tensions and was increasingly unpopular with African Americans. A Detroit Urban League official stated, "No single governmental activity has done more to disperse, disorganize, and discourage neighborhood cohesion than has urban redevelopment. These freeways were meant to facilitate economic growth in Detroit. In reality, it hastened the exodus. They provided a launching point for which suburbs would develop by making the land more accessible and commute times to the central city shorter." Government policies providing tax incentives and subsidies to single-family homes exacerbated suburbanization and defined their character. The Federal Housing Administration, to increase homeownership, provided insurance on mortgages that meet certain criteria, repaying the principal to lenders if borrowers default. In order to qualify and meet a high score, mortgages had to meet certain standards that were characteristic of newly built suburbs. Large homes to increase demand for labor and materials, homogeneous neighborhoods to preserve housing prices, setbacks of 15 feet with well-manicured lawns, and strict separation of land uses. Additionally, homeownership provided tax exemptions not available to renters. Mortgage interest does not count as taxable income in what's called the mortgage interest deduction. This encourages people to spend more on their homes. The more they spend on their mortgage, the less they pay in taxes. Homeowners are also not taxed on profit from home sales. Between 1951 and 1997, profits would not be taxed on a home sale if they used the money to buy a larger, more expensive home. This encouraged people to purchase increasingly larger homes even if they wanted to downsize. Countless tax breaks also favored new construction, expanding the amount of developed land and accelerating sprawl. In addition to these factors, deindustrialization hastened the decline of the city and the subsequent growth of the suburbs. The automobile industry was very bad at weathering recessions because of their reliance on consumer demand. The subsequent recessions of the 1950s led to thousands of layoffs and plant closures. This was made significantly worse by competition from foreign automakers such as Toyota and Honda. Between 1947 and 1963, despite the number of working-age men increasing, 134,000 manufacturing jobs were lost. The Michigan Employment Security Commission reported that between 1953 and 1960, Detroit's east side had seen 10 plant closures and the loss of over 71,000 jobs. Of these 10 plants, 7 closed outright, 2 had moved to the suburbs, and 1 had left Michigan. This loss of disposable income rippled through Detroit's economy. Everything except the bare living necessities were affected. As some of these plants left for the suburbs, white residents were able to follow, resulting in a decline in Detroit's population for the first time in its history, and a trend that has continued up until recently. Rigid residential segregation prevented blacks from moving closer to jobs. Meanwhile, as Detroit's population steadily declined, the suburbs rapidly expanded. Warren, Detroit's largest suburb, had a population of over 42,000 in 1950, and this grew to just under 180,000 by 1970, a 420% increase in just 20 years. With the changing demographics of the city as black Detroiters comprised a larger portion of the community, black residents began to advocate for fair housing, and led to increasingly reactionary efforts against desegregation by racially conservative whites. In 1948, the Supreme Court ruled in Shelley v. Kramer that restrictive covenants were unconstitutional. Suddenly, black Detroiters could live wherever they wanted, and those with the means pushed the boundaries of black Detroit as more white Detroiters began to move to the suburbs. However, those who suffered the effects of deindustrialization and poverty remained trapped in deteriorating inner-city neighborhoods. Real estate brokers made this transition possible. Some, like James Del Rio and the Detroit Realist Association, genuinely believed in equal housing and integration. However, most real estate firms were not as noble in their intentions. Several opportunistic firms used a technique called block busting. These firms would take advantage of black Detroiters' need for adequate housing and fuel white homeowners' fear of a black takeover in their neighborhood. Their technique of working both sides, feeding the hope and fear that integration brought, was very profitable. They would start by selling a home to a black family or even hire a black woman to push a stroller through a neighborhood, then sow panic among white neighbors by mailing pamphlets saying their property values would decrease if black families moved in. This resulted in them selling their homes and moving. Real estate agents sold homes to African Americans for much higher prices, exploiting their desire to escape deteriorating conditions. In 1950, white Detroiters held a firm majority at 84% of the population, while black residents only accounted for 16%. Over the next few decades, this would collapse as white flight accelerated and Southern African Americans continued to migrate in search of opportunity. Black Detroiters in 1960 comprised 29% of the population and jumped to 44% by 1970. White Detroiters would continue to hold a slim majority at 55.5% of the population. Fearing to lose their majority status, the Detroit Police Department and many white residents resisted integration through violent means. The DPD at this time was an openly racist and white supremacist institution. The department repressed civil rights organizations and attempted to contain blacks into certain neighborhoods through violent means. Liberal city governments as well as conservative governments implemented discriminatory policies abused by the police. The Jerome Kavanaugh administration, widely seen as liberal, implemented the Get Tough policies that militarized the police and gave them the authority to search anyone with a stop and frisk law and arrest them. In 1971, the Lethal Undercover Unit STRESS, an acronym for Stop the Robberies, Enjoy Safe Streets, was founded and patrolled black neighborhoods to instill fear. In just 3 years, 22 people were murdered by STRESS. The tensions brought by police brutality and housing segregation boiled under the surface until July 1967, when the city was engulfed in the flames born out of the rage of Detroit's black residents. The displaced people from urban renewal were shoehorned into the overcrowding, under-resourced areas of the city, such as the neighborhood of 12th and Claremont, the origin site of the '67 rebellion. The mass arrest of 85 African Americans celebrating the term of Vietnam War veterans was the immediate cause of the ensuing violence. Residents of the neighborhood gathered around the scene, yelled, and threw bottles at the police. Feeling outnumbered, the police retreated, but the rage felt by residents never subsided. They looted and burned the stores of owners they felt were taking advantage of the community. Lawlessness spread across the entire city for 6 days and nights. The riot was only quelled when the U.S. Army and Michigan National Guard occupied the city. By the end, 43 people had been killed, 1,189 injured. over 7,200 arrested, and over 400 buildings destroyed. White flight accelerated as the city was viewed as unsafe. Finally, in 1973, Detroit narrowly elected its first black mayor, Coleman Young, with a coalition of liberal white and black voters. Early in 1967, black communities and white progressives attempted to elect Richard Austin, a moderate black liberal. However, an extremely close vote of 257,000 to 250,000 elected the conservative Roman Gribbs. Gribbs was the choice law enforcement candidate, and this loss only energized African Americans to become more politically active. In the next election, the black community wanted a candidate who was less moderate and more outspoken on discrimination. Their choice, Coleman Young, would go on to dominate Detroit politics for the next 2 decades. Young promised to keep racial equality at the forefront and ran on issues such as housing reform, education reform, and the creation of a People's Police Department. On November 6, 1973, Young was elected mayor over his opponent, John Nichols, by a slim majority of 233,000 to 216,000, with a coalition of liberal white voters, the black community, and unions. 1973 to 1993. For the next 2 decades under Coleman Young's tenure, African Americans held power in Detroit, but because of white flight and an economic recession, he was unable to deliver on this promise of uplifting the black community as Detroit had become impoverished. Young's unapologetic and confrontational attitude and lingering racism in the suburbs led to conflict with the affluent majority white communities surrounding Detroit, leading to the failure of regionalism. The hostility of many whites in the city to Young was a defining factor for his early tenure. Many conservative whites believed Young could not be even-handed in racial matters, and that they would be treated as blacks were by white mayors. This belief only increased as his tenure went on. Between 1970 and 1980, 310,000 white residents moved to the suburbs. For the first time in Detroit's history, more people lived in the surrounding communities than the city itself. In the aftermath of this mass exodus, entire neighborhoods would be boarded up and left to rot. As white Detroiters left, they took their tax base and businesses with them. Coupled with a national economic recession, many Detroiters fell into poverty. The entire nation experienced a recession in 1973 due to an oil embargo. However, Detroit suffered acutely due to worsened deindustrialization and the complete dissolution of its tax base. By 1980, industry had largely left the city, searching for cheaper labor across the globe. The Reagan administration diverted more funding towards worthy white suburbs away from the unworthy, predominantly black communities. As the economic prospects of the city's residents declined and poverty increased, crime and blight naturally followed and provided a potent reason for leaving for those with the means. The psychiatrist Mindy Fullilove observes a connection between trauma, violence, and mental illness. In the upheaval caused by the serial displacement and deindustrialization, the epidemics of heroin and crack cocaine took off. Violence soared. Trauma, as a result of these accumulating disasters, became a major source of psychiatric illness and contributed to ill health. A white resident of the East Side Fordham-Morehouse area, dubbed the safest neighborhood in Detroit, said crime was inevitably sweeping across the entire city. It's 1 mile away now, and we're watching it coming slowly towards us. As the tax base continued to plummet, city services such as public schools, parks and recreation, trash removal, and policing declined, continuing to draw more out in a compounding, vicious cycle. Mayor Young attempted to remedy these issues with a tax relief in exchange for industry remaining in the city, but only succeeded to a limited extent. The conditions of the deteriorating inner city are of stark contrast to those of the surrounding affluent suburbs that use zoning and other methods to keep poor and black residents out and exacerbated urban sprawl. Studies have shown that anti-density zoning practices are associated with less black residents in a particular municipality and the concentration of blacks in the inner city. Historic patterns of employment discrimination kept African American wages low, and increasingly under-resourced public schools in Detroit made black economic prospects worse. Livonia, an all-white suburb at this time, passed a law prohibiting apartments from being built in favor of single-family homes. This in turn denied low-income residents who couldn't afford a single-family home from living in the city. Low-density zoning also exacerbates the costly growth of urban sprawl because it encourages an expansion of the built-up area to accommodate the vast expanse of single-family homes, instead of a more concentrated model. With the increased migration out of the inner core to the suburbs and the fragmentation of the region, the regionalism movement enjoyed a brief comeback as a solution. However, conflict between city leaders in Detroit and the suburbs caused this plan to fail. Limited regional governments already existed. In 1967, the Southeast Michigan Council of Governments, known as SEMCOG, was founded as the regional planning agency to coordinate services such as transportation and plan for the controlled growth of the metro area, but was weak because of voluntary membership. Several suburban municipalities had refused to join SEMCOG, giving the reason of refusing to subsidize Detroit. "You want to do away with the last vestige of home rule and brainwashing innocent people into the vice-like grip of metropolitan government," yelled Anderson Arbery, a resident of Midland, at an early SEMCOG meeting. SEMCOG was also weak due to each municipality having the same voting power, regardless of population. This allowed relatively smaller suburbs with similar vested interests much more voting power than Detroit did. The Ford-funded Metropolitan Fund advocated replacing SEMCOG with a new regional body that would coordinate housing, transportation, and economic development across the region to prevent sprawl. The organization authored a collection of 12 writings called the Regionalist Papers that would shape the organization's belief in future legislation. Ken Mathewson advocating for reconstituting the body of SEMCOG to a 41-member body composing of directly elected representatives and local government officials with more authority in addressing social and economic issues. He also argued for the end of voluntary membership, comparing it to the failures of the Articles of Confederation. However, these proposals were more popular with corporate leaders than elected officials. Legislation proposing these measures, the Area Unity Bill, was introduced in 1975 in the Michigan legislature, but failed due to widespread opposition from both suburbanites and Detroiters.
Not in my city.
Push a little harder, sir.
Not in my city.
And you're in our city, if you would, sir.
Not in our city.
Oakland County Commissioner Lawrence Pernick described the Metropolitan Fund as basically a handful of people with big money behind them who would rather deal with a couple of regional officials than have to go from community to take care of their problem. Detroiters were also skeptical of the proposal, believing that the suburban advocates of the proposal were attempting to take political power away from black Detroiters. Coleman Young said of the proposal, "These people who fled to the suburbs to escape Detroit's problem in the first place aren't going to help support Detroit now. I'm not willing to deal with people who have refused to deal fairly with me. I'm going to turn over my autonomy to people like that? I've got to look askance at this whole proposal." Los Angeles Mayor Tom Bradley argued in the Regionalist Papers that elected black officials should work towards their goal within the institution rather than rejecting it wholesale. Despite setbacks, the fight for regional government continued throughout the decades, most prominently in the 1991 SEMCOG public meetings as part of the Regional Development Initiative, or RDI, but failed again because crucial local government actors did not accept regional unity. RDI's purpose was to propose initiatives to halt urban sprawl and uneven economic developments. They predicted that by 2010, the region's population would grow by only 6%, while the built area would only grow by 40%, shifting people, jobs, and wealth away from the core and exponentially increasing the cost to maintain this infrastructure. The Oversight Committee put race at the center for understanding sprawl, understanding that racial unity was essential to achieving regional unity. Proposals including attacking discrimination with a renewed commitment to fair and open housing, land use plan that prioritizes compact development, guidelines that protect agricultural and environmental areas and encourages the redevelopment of older, urban communities, and restructuring the tax incentives and subsidies that encourage growth of new areas over the maintenance of older ones. Others included a regional attack on poverty that would create a regional sales tax dedicated to creating economic opportunities. Another regional tax would provide funding to public transport and road improvements. However, again, both black and white leaders were hesitant of these proposals. Officials from the suburbs saw it as an attempt to restrict their growth and attempt to redistribute the wealth from the rich to the poor. Self-described sprawler and Oakland County Executive L. Brooks Patterson said, "I don't give a damn about Detroit," and compared the fate of Detroit to that of the Indians on the reservation.
The magazine quotes Patterson as saying, "I made a prediction a long time ago and it's come to pass. I said, what we're gonna do is turn Detroit into an Indian reservation where we herd all the Indians into the city, build a fence around it, and then throw in the blankets and corn."
One Oakland County official called the proposals Marxist. Likewise, black leaders were also opposed to unified government. The head of New Detroit Incorporated called the proponents' remarks racist for implying black communities cannot function independent from white suburbs. 1993 to the present. The trend of urban sprawl after Young's tenure has continued as the peripheral regions of the metropolitan area are expanded despite minimal growth in population. White flight is still a motivating factor in growth as inner ring suburbs have begun to integrate, drawing racially conservative white residents to outer ring suburbs. Meanwhile, investment and development has begun to transform central areas in Detroit, pulling wealthier, primarily white residents in and pushing low-income, primarily black residents out. Black residents have been leaving Detroit at an increasing rate in the past few decades. Since 2000, 295,000 black Detroiters have left the city, more than any city in the nation. Former residents cite low employment, lack of grocery stores, and neighborhoods characterized by abandonment, crime, and blight. "It's tough to find opportunities in Detroit," said Marcus Carey. "You're always working class if you stay here." Detroit Future City found a report that Detroit's highest paying jobs were predominantly going towards white suburbanites, while many black Detroiters were stuck with low paying jobs. This, in combination with similar housing prices in inner ring suburbs, facilitate black migration out of Detroit. Residential discrimination is still a driving factor in Metro Detroit. In a 1993 University of Michigan study, 66% of white Metro Detroit residents in 1992 responded they would be uncomfortable if half their neighborhood was black, and 52% said they would move out. As demographics shift and inner ring suburbs become more integrated, white flight to outer ring suburbs contributes to the region's expansion. In 2002, Semcock demographer Jim Rogers described this process bluntly. Clearly, people are willing to spend to indulge their preferences and fears. Many white residents still fear that desegregation will reduce poverty values and increase blight and crime. In their mind, they're making economic decisions to move while property values are still high. In the year 2000, white residents accounted for 91% of the population of Warren. In 2020, they accounted for 64% of the population. This process of white flight once again causes cities to defund the services that retain residents, such as library services and community centers. Meanwhile, job loss and divestment in inner-ring suburbs hurt working-class white residents. Tom Barwin, former city manager of Ferndale, a city just north of Detroit, said, "Cities are beginning to fall like dominoes. We're in a crisis up to our knees. All of the older suburbs are going to experience the cycle of decline that Detroit went through." Meanwhile, the 10 fastest growing municipalities in Metro Detroit are all more than 80% white and located on the edge of the metropolitan area. A former Canton Township trustee, a community on the periphery of the metro area, said, "It's really just a lot of social engineering. We looked back at what made America work 100 years ago and replicated it." These findings challenge the assumption many have that the issue of housing discrimination and white flight is no longer an issue in Metro Detroit. Moreover, as the peripheries of the region grow, the central areas of the greater downtown are experiencing new investment and development after the 2008 financial crisis, drawing wealthier white residents while pushing out lower-income residents as the cost of living increases in a process of gentrification. Ron Glada, the lawyer and activist, predicted this investment and its effects in the early 1990s. Ultimately, the market is going to determine what happens to Detroit. Look at the history of capital. It destroys an area, reduces the prices of property, and then it flows back in because a lot of money can be made, and that's what's going to happen. The 2008 housing crisis and the 2012 bankruptcy of Detroit had devastating effects on the city and would continue migration out. Between 2004 and 2007, predatory subprime loaning from companies was rampant and led to a spike in mortgage foreclosures. In 2005, about 60% of mortgages in Detroit were classified as subprime, targeting individuals with unfavorable credit histories and imposing higher interest rates than prime mortgages. This was done by companies like Quicken Loans, now Rocket Mortgage. Black customers were more than 70% more likely to receive subprime loans compared to white counterparts with similar financial backgrounds. Compounding this issue, the city neglected to accurately evaluate property values during and after the housing market crash, stealing approximately $600 million worth of property taxes from homeowners. Between 2011 and 2015, 30% of all Detroit residences faced foreclosure due to unpaid property taxes. In March 2013, Michigan Governor Rick Snyder appointed Kevin Orr as the unelected emergency manager of Detroit to resolve the city's financial issues. Orr's authority exceeded that of even the mayor and city council, and in July 2013, coercively declared the city of Detroit bankrupt. While foreclosures were happening on a mass scale in the inner city, More than $9 billion was invested in Detroit between 2009 and 2014, primarily by local billionaires Dan Gilbert and Mike Ilitch. As Gilbert's business partner John Ligner put it, "Wish you bought gold in 06, you'll wish you bought Detroit in 12. Detroit has bottomed out, so now there's nothing but upside." Various low-income residents of the area were ordered to vacate their properties as large corporations and international developers purchased the buildings. In April 2013, over 200 units of low-income residents in Cass Corridor, now referred to as Midtown, were evicted and given 30 days to vacate their property. Attempts to address the problem by designating a percentage of new housing as affordable has been futile, as what's considered affordable is determined by the median income of the Metro Detroit region, $68,000, rather than the median income for Detroit, $37,000, making the units inaccessible to most Detroiters. The mass exodus of white residents from Detroit and the expansion of the metropolitan regions was largely due to the racist and segregationist policies of the city, state, and federal governments. Housing discrimination and urban renewal projects funded and legitimized by the federal government created tensions and divisions that tore the city apart. Tax incentives and subsidies, along with the building of expressways, facilitated the economic growth of the suburbs and hollowed out the city. The failure of the regionalism movement to create a cohesive regional strategy to manage growth leaves the continued sprawl of the region left unchecked. By reflecting on the historical trajectory of urban sprawl, valuable insight is gained into potential solutions for the future. The evolution of urban sprawl reveals the challenges posed by unchecked expansion, such as environmental degradation and social fragmentation along racial lines. Understanding the root causes and consequences